Chapter 1 Mystery Girl. It was a picturesque spring morning in Whistler, a charming mountain village nestled in British Columbia, Canada. The sun cast a warm glow over the landscape, and the sky was a vivid blue. Outside a quaint cafe, a young man sat at one of the tables, savoring his breakfast and a cup of coffee. His name was Nick Lortz, and life seemed perfect at that moment. A waiter approached his table with a smile. "More coffee?" he asked. "Yeah, that'd be great," Nick replied, handing over his cup. The waiter glanced at the camera resting on Nick's table. "On vacation?" he asked. "No, I'm working," Nick said with a chuckle. "I'm a travel writer. I'm working on a book about North American mountains. Got some great shots of your mountain here." The two men turned their gaze to Whistler Mountain, which towered majestically behind the village, bathed in the morning sunlight. "Do you travel a lot then?" the waiter asked. "All the time," Nick replied. "I write books and articles for travel magazines about countries, towns, rivers, mountains, people. You name it." The waiter nodded but then glanced over Nick's shoulder. "There's a girl across the street," he said. "Do you know her?" Nick turned to look. Across the street stood a young woman, about 25 years old, with striking features. "No," Nick said, curious. "Well, she seems to know you," the waiter said with a grin. "She's watching you pretty closely. Have a nice day." With that, the waiter disappeared back into the cafe. Nick continued observing the girl. She glanced at him briefly before pretending to study the shop window, only to look back again moments later. "She looks worried," Nick thought. "Is she waiting for someone?" Suddenly, the girl smiled, then walked across the street. She approached Nick's table and sat down without hesitation, placing her half-open bag on the table. "Hi, I'm Jan," she said with a friendly smile. "Do you remember me? We met at a party in Toronto." Nick raised an eyebrow, amused. "Hi, January. I'm Nick. But no, we didn't meet at a party in Toronto. I don't go to many parties and never in Toronto." "Oh," Jan said, seemingly unfazed. She didn't make any move to leave. "Have some coffee," Nick offered, gesturing to the waiter. "The party story wasn't true, but it's a beautiful morning, and you're good company." She laughed. "Maybe it was Montreal or New York then. And yes, I'd love some coffee." When her coffee arrived, Nick asked, "So what brings you to Whistler? Do you live here?" "Oh no," she said, hesitating. "I'm just passing through. I'm a travel writer," Nick said, steering the conversation. "I'm writing about famous mountains." "That's interesting," Jan replied, though her expression betrayed a lack of interest. Her gaze kept darting across the street. Nick followed her line of sight. A tall, thin man with very short white hair had just crossed the road. He looked to be about 60. Jan's eyes lingered on him, but she quickly looked away when she noticed Nick watching her. "Are you waiting for someone?" Nick asked. "No," she said quickly. Then, changing the subject, she asked, "Where are you headed next?" "Vancouver for a few days," Nick replied. "When are you leaving?" "Later this morning." Nick noticed a letter peeking out of Jan's bag. The visible words caught his eye. "We can meet at the Empress Hotel Victoria, Vancouver Island on Friday afternoon." So she's headed to Vancouver too, Nick thought. Out of the blue, Jan asked, "Do you like movies?" "Movies? Sure, I love them." "Why?" "I know a man who loves movies. People call him Mr. Hollywood," she said with a sly smile. "Can I call you Mr. Hollywood too?" Nick laughed. "Why not? And what should I call you?" "Call me Mystery Girl," she said, her smile widening. That's a perfect name for you, Nick said. Just then, the man with white hair entered the cafe. He didn't acknowledge Jan or Nick, but sat at a nearby table, ordered breakfast, and began reading a magazine. Jan glanced at him, but quickly turned away. Do you know him? Nick asked. No, she said abruptly, finishing her coffee and standing up. I must go now, she added. Nick stood too, ready to say goodbye. But before he could, Jan leaned forward, cupped his face in her hands, and kissed him. Drive carefully, Mr. Hollywood, she said with a dazzling smile before walking away quickly. Nick sat back down, dazed, and watched her enter a nearby hotel. What on earth was that all about? He wondered. The man with white hair glanced at Nick briefly, before returning to his magazine. A few minutes later, Nick left the cafe, camera in hand. As he walked to his car parked outside the hotel, the man with white hair followed him at a discreet distance. From a window high up in the hotel, Jan watched the street below. She saw Nick get into his blue car and drive off, while the man quickly got into a red car and followed him. Jan smiled to herself before turning to pack her things. Chapter 2. A Hand in the Back. That evening in his Vancouver hotel room, Nick couldn't stop thinking about the girl he'd met at the Whistler Cafe. Why had she joined him? She didn't know him, and the story about a party in Toronto was clearly a lie. She had seemed worried, but about what? And then there was the kiss. It had been nice, of course, but why had she done it? Maybe she liked my face, Nick thought, or my brown eyes. But I'm not going to see her again, so it doesn't matter. Forget it. Trying to put the thoughts aside, Nick grabbed some money and went downstairs to the hotel restaurant. Unfortunately, all the tables were occupied, so he decided to head to Gastown to find a place to eat. After dinner at a cozy restaurant, he took a leisurely walk through Gastown and Chinatown. Vancouver had a welcoming vibe, and Nick enjoyed wandering the streets, browsing the shop windows, and watching the bustling evening crowd. As night fell and the streets grew busier, Nick began making his way back to the hotel. At a busy intersection, he joined a small group of people waiting to cross the street. Beside him stood a tall woman in a blue dress, who turned and smiled. It's the first warm evening of spring, she said. It's nice to be out after the long, cold winter. Yes, Nick replied. It's great. Suddenly, Nick felt a sharp push in his back. He stumbled forward and fell face first into the road, right in front of an oncoming green car. People screamed, but the car stopped just inches from Nick's head. The woman in the blue dress rushed into the street, grabbing Nick and helping him to his feet. Are you okay? What happened? She asked. The driver of the green car leaned out, shouting angrily, but Nick barely heard him. Somebody pushed me, Nick said, shaken. I didn't fall, someone pushed me. Pushed you? The woman asked. By who? I didn't see anyone. Nick scanned the crowd of faces around him, but none were familiar. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw a tall, thin man with very short white hair walking quickly away. The man didn't turn back. Hey, you! Nick shouted. Wait! The man didn't stop and soon disappeared into the crowd. Did he push you? The woman asked. I don't know, Nick admitted. Do you know him? No, Nick said. But I've seen him before somewhere. The woman glanced at her watch and began to step away. I must get home, she said. Are you okay now? Yeah, Nick said. Thanks for your help. Be careful, she said with a smile before disappearing into the night. Back in his hotel room, Nick sat on the bed, replaying the incident in his mind. It was an accident, he told himself. Nobody pushed me, it had to be an accident. Nobody's trying to kill me, and there are plenty of men in Vancouver with white hair. Even so, the thought gnawed at him. Unable to sleep, Nick listened to the sound of cars on the street and stared out at the night sky. He tried writing more for his book about mountains, but couldn't focus. Frustrated, he climbed back into bed and picked up one of the magazines left in the room. He flipped through the pages absent-mindedly until a photograph caught his attention. His heart skipped a beat. It was her, the mystery girl from the Whistler Cafe. She was standing next to a man in his early 50s in the garden of a grand luxurious house. Both were smiling for the camera. The caption beneath the photo read, "Canadian millionaire Howard Hudson and his daughter, Meg, at their home in Toronto." Not Jan, Nick thought. Not mystery girl. Meg Hudson, the daughter of a millionaire. Nick read the caption again, his mind racing. Why had she sat with him in the cafe? Why had she lied about her name and kissed him? Millionaire daughters didn't just sit with strangers in cafes. And certainly not strangers they kissed goodbye. Nick's thoughts returned to Whistler. He recalled the man sitting near them in the cafe. A tall, thin man with short white hair. That same man. Nick didn't sleep much that night. Chapter 3. A Walk in the Park. The next day, Thursday, Nick spent the morning in his hotel room, writing about mountains. After a productive few hours, he decided to take a break and drove to Stanley Park. In the peaceful afternoon, he sat on a bench, reading a book for an hour before setting off on a walk among the tall trees. The park was quiet and nearly deserted. The stillness gave Nick time to think. His thoughts drifted to Meg Hudson and the man with white hair. Do they know each other? He wondered. Why did she tell me to drive carefully? And why did she call me Mr. Hollywood? None of this makes sense. The rustling of leaves suddenly broke his train of thought. Nick froze. A loud, sharp sound echoed through the trees. That was a gun, he realized, his pulse quickening. Another shot rang out, and something struck the tree just above his head. Panic surged through him. Someone's shooting at me. Nick turned and bolted, weaving through the trees. The forest was dim, the sunlight barely filtering through the dense canopy. The solitude that had once felt peaceful now felt menacing. There was no one around to help. I need to get to my car. Or find people. The police, he thought as he ran. The sound of heavy footsteps behind him spurred him on. His pursuer was close, and Nick pushed himself to run faster. After several minutes of sprinting, the footsteps faded. Nick slowed to a stop, his heart pounding in his chest. He strained to hear any sound. Nothing. Silence. Nick stood still, catching his breath. Fear gripped him. First someone tries to push me in front of a car. And now this? What's going on? After a few more seconds of tense listening, he cautiously made his way back toward his car. Every step felt like a gamble, but no one emerged from the trees. Finally, he reached an area where people strolled leisurely. A mother with her children, boys kicking a football, two men walking a dog. The sight of others calmed him. No one's going to shoot at me with all these people around, he reassured himself. 10 minutes later, he reached his car. But as he approached, he saw something that made his stomach drop. A piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper. Nick grabbed it and read the words, his hands shaking. I'm going to kill you, Mr. Hollywood. Without hesitation, Nick drove to the nearest police station. He waited anxiously for half an hour before a tired-looking young policeman called him into a small room. Nick recounted everything: his near-death experiences in Whistler and Vancouver, the gunshots in the park, the note. The officer listened and jotted down his account in a notebook. "So, what are you going to do about it?" Nick asked, his voice tinged with desperation. "Nothing," the policeman replied flatly. "Nothing." Nick's anger flared. "Someone shot at me. I found a death threat on my car. You can't just do nothing." "Mr. Lords," the policeman said, rubbing his temples, "do you know how many people in this city have guns?" "I don't know," Nick admitted. "Exactly. And you didn't see the shooter. You don't know if it was a man, a woman, or even a kid. You didn't get a good look at the person who pushed you. We don't have any leads. Maybe it's an old girlfriend who's upset. Or maybe someone hates your books. It could be anything." "What about the man with white hair?" Nick pressed. "He was at the cafe in Whistler when Meg Hudson called me Mr. Hollywood. Now someone's shooting at me, and I get a note addressed to Mr. Hollywood. It has to be connected." The policeman shrugged. "We all want answers to our questions, Mr. Lords. But we don't always get them." Nick left the station feeling frustrated and powerless. As he drove back to his hotel, fear gnawed at him. How did the man with white hair find me in Vancouver? He wondered. Did he follow me all the way from Whistler? Is he following me now? Could he be staying at the same hotel? Maybe even in the room next to mine with his gun? The thought sent a chill down Nick's spine. Chapter 4. The Man with White Hair. Nick parked his car in front of the hotel, scanning the street for any sign of the man with white hair. The coast seemed clear, but he wasn't taking any chances. He quickly got out of the car and hurried through the hotel doors, heading straight to the reception desk. "I'm looking for a man with very short white hair," he said to the receptionist. "He's tall, thin, and probably in his 60s. I think he's staying here." The receptionist barely looked up. "There are a lot of visitors in this hotel," she said, unimpressed. "Do you know his name?" "No, I don't," Nick admitted. "He's a friend of a friend. He arrived yesterday, and I really need to find him. It's important. Please, can you help me?" The woman sighed and gave him a polite but dismissive smile. "There are 350 rooms in this hotel, sir, and at least 30 or 40 men with white hair. I can't possibly remember all their names." Before Nick could respond, she turned away to answer a ringing phone. Frustrated, Nick stepped back from the desk. "A drink. I need a drink," he thought. He walked into the hotel bar, ordered a drink, and sat at a table, trying to plan his next move. Then, a memory struck him. The letter he had glimpsed in Meg Hudson's bag back in Whistler. It had mentioned a meeting at the Empress Hotel in Victoria on Friday afternoon. And tomorrow is Friday, he realized. "I'm going to Victoria," he decided. To the Empress Hotel. That evening, after dinner at the hotel restaurant, Nick got up from his table and froze. There he was, the man with white hair. The man stood at the hotel desk, his distinctive white head visible above the surrounding crowd. Nick's pulse quickened. He needed to act fast. "Excuse me," Nick muttered as he pushed through the restaurant. But just as he was about to reach the desk, a small boy darted in front of him. Nick collided with the boy, sending them both to the floor. The boy immediately began to cry, drawing the attention of a woman nearby. "Hey!" she exclaimed, glaring at Nick. "I'm so sorry," Nick stammered as he helped the boy to his feet. "Are you okay? Be more careful next time," the woman scolded. Nick muttered another apology and hurried toward the desk. But it was too late. The man with white hair was gone. Where did he go? Nick demanded of the receptionist. The man with short white hair. Where is he? She seemed annoyed by his urgency. Mr. Vickers? She asked. Vickers? Nick repeated. Is that his name? What's his room number? I'm sorry, the receptionist said firmly. I can't give you that information. But I need to. She cut him off, turning away to answer another phone call. Defeated, Nick went upstairs to his room. As he closed the door, the name Vickers echoed in his mind. Does Meg Hudson know Mr. Vickers? He wondered. Sitting on the edge of the bed, he clenched his fists. I need answers, he thought. And I need them quickly. Chapter 5 Vancouver Island. Nick drove south from Vancouver to Tawasin, where he planned to catch the 1 p.m. ferry to Vancouver Island. The road was bustling with traffic, black cars, white cars, red cars, green cars. Every few minutes, he glanced in his rearview mirror, wondering if Vickers might be following him. When Nick reached the ferry terminal, he drove his car onto the ship, surrounded by a sea of other vehicles. Leaving his car, he walked up to the ferry's upper decks, weaving through the crowds. He scanned every face, especially those of older men. Some wore hats, obscuring their hair, but Nick looked for someone tall and thin. The ferry began to move, and Nick felt a slight relief. He headed to the restaurant for a quick meal, still keeping an eye out. As more passengers arrived, Nick watched each older man carefully. Once, he thought he saw a glimpse of white hair in the crowd, but the figure disappeared before he could confirm. Maybe he's not on the ferry, Nick thought. Maybe he stayed in Vancouver. After 90 minutes, the ferry docked at Swartz Bay, 20 miles north of Victoria. Nick returned to his car, blending into the traffic streaming off the ferry. As he drove toward Victoria, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. A red car trailed him about 200 yards back, matching his speed. Did I see that car earlier on the road to Tawasin? He wondered. Nick slowed down slightly, hoping to get a better look, but the red car stayed at the same distance. He couldn't make out the driver's face or hair. However, as he entered Victoria's busy streets, the red car disappeared into the chaos. Victoria, known for its gardens and historic architecture, was a beautiful city, but Nick barely noticed as he drove straight to the Empress Hotel. Inside, he approached the reception desk. Can I help you? A young man behind the desk asked. I'm meeting a friend here this afternoon, Nick said. Miss Hudson. The receptionist frowned. Miss Hudson? Let me check. He walked away, returning a few moments later. Sorry, there's no one by that name staying here. Nick pulled the magazine photo of Meg Hudson and her father from his pocket. This is her, he said, showing the picture. The receptionist studied it for a moment. Oh, you mean Howard Hudson's daughter, he said. She's not staying here, but I saw her about 15 minutes ago. She was with a man. A man? Nick asked. Did you hear where they were going? The receptionist hesitated. The Tio? The Tio? Nick repeated, confused. What's that? Meanwhile, Vickers, the man with white hair, was growing increasingly frustrated. He had followed Nick relentlessly since Whistler, but in Victoria's bustling streets, he'd lost sight of the blue car. I must find him, Vickers muttered to himself. It has to happen today. Driving through the city, he passed several large hotels. Then, as he rounded a corner, he spotted it, the Empress Hotel. Parked outside was the familiar blue car. Vickers drove past, parked his own car, and hurried back to the hotel on foot. Crossing the street, he approached the building, walking slowly past its large ground-floor windows. Inside, he saw a lounge filled with people seated at tables. Scanning the crowd, his eyes stopped on her, Meg Hudson. She was sitting with two men. Their backs were turned to him, but one of them was wearing a green shirt. Vickers's lips curled into a grim smile. Emar Hollywood, he murmured. Reaching into his pocket, he felt the cold, hard weight of the gun. His fingers tightened around it as he moved toward the hotel doors. Chapter 6: A Tea Party. Nick stepped into the elegant tea room of the Empress Hotel and immediately spotted her, Meg Hudson. She sat at a table with a man who looked about 30, tall, sun-kissed, and dressed entirely in white. He leaned toward her, saying something that made her laugh. She seemed carefree and happy. A waiter approached Nick. "Can I get you some tea?" he asked. "No thanks," Nick replied. "I'm with the two people over there." Without waiting for a response, he strode toward Meg's table. "Hello, mystery girl," Nick said, stopping beside them. "Remember me? We met at Whistler. Your name was Jan then, but perhaps today it's Meg Hudson." Meg's face flushed deep red. "Oh," she said, caught off guard. "Who is this, Meg?" asked the man in white, his voice firm but calm. "This is Nick," Meg said quickly. "He's a writer. Nick, this is Craig Winters. Sometimes called Mr. Hollywood," Nick added, eyeing Winters carefully. "But how did you know that?" asked Craig Winters, frowning. "I guessed," Nick said, sitting down uninvited. "And I think I'm starting to understand. But let me ask you something, Mr. Winters. Does someone want to kill you?" Winters stiffened, his face draining of color. "Kill me? What are you talking about?" Meg leaned forward, her voice tense. "What is this about, Nick?" "Answer this first," Nick insisted. "Meg, back in Whistler, you called me Mr. Hollywood on purpose, didn't you? You wanted the man with white hair to hear it. Am I right?" Meg hesitated before nodding slowly. "Yes." "Why?" Nick pressed. "I wanted him to follow you, not me," Meg admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Nick stared at her. "Why?" "I think he's a detective," Meg explained. "I believe he's working for my father. I saw him soon after I left Toronto, and I know he's been following me ever since." She placed her hand on Craig Winters's arm. "My father doesn't like Craig. A month ago, he told me to stop seeing him. He knows I'm not happy, and I think he guessed I'd try to meet Craig. Now he wants to find him and stop us from seeing each other." "Stop him?" Nick asked, his tone sharp. "Or kill him?" "No," Meg insisted. "Daddy wouldn't. That man with white hair pushed me in front of a car in Vancouver," Nick interrupted. "And he shot at me in Stanley Park." "What?" Meg exclaimed, horrified. "Tell me about this man with white hair," Craig Winters said suddenly, his voice tight. Nick turned to him. "He's about 60, tall and thin. Do you know his name?" "Vickers," Nick said. Craig Winters's face went pale. "Vickers," he repeated, his voice shaking. "Did he follow you to Victoria? Did he follow you here?" "I don't know," Nick admitted, watching Winters closely. "But you're afraid of him. Why? Why does this man want to kill you, Winters?" Before Winters could answer, Meg's face went ashen. "Oh no," she whispered. "Look." Nick and Craig turned toward the door. There stood the man with white hair, scanning the room. His sharp eyes locked onto their table, and he began walking toward them, his hand reaching into his pocket. For a moment, none of them moved. Then Craig Winters leapt to his feet, pointing at Nick. "That's Mr. Hollywood," he screamed. "That man there." Vickers pulled a gun from his pocket. "This is for Anna," he shouted. Nick moved instinctively, flipping the tea table over and diving to the floor as the shot rang out. The bullet whizzed over his head and Meg screamed. Craig Winters staggered back, clutching his arm. Blood seeped through his white shirt. More screams erupted as the tea room descended into chaos. 2 waiters rushed Vickers, tackling him to the ground before he could fire again. "Call the police," someone shouted. As the room filled with commotion, Nick crawled out from behind the overturned table, his heart pounding. Vickers lay pinned on the floor, his face twisted in rage, while Meg knelt beside Craig, trying to stop the bleeding. Nick sat back against a chair, breathing heavily. "Who's Anna?" he muttered to himself. Chapter 7. At the police station. It was 7:30 p.m., and Nick and Meg sat in a small, quiet room at the police station. The man called Vickers was in another room with 3 detectives and a doctor. Craig Winters was in the hospital, recovering from the gunshot wound. The door opened, and Detective Edmonds came in with 2 cups of coffee. He placed them on the table and started to leave, but Meg stopped him. "Detective Edmonds," Meg asked anxiously, "has the hospital called? Is Craig going to be all right?" "Winters is going to be okay," Edmonds replied. "Can I call the hospital now?" Meg asked, looking hopeful. "I'd like you to wait," Edmonds said. "Detective Keat will be here in a minute. He just arrived from the airport." He glanced toward the open door and added, "Ah, here he is now." A second detective entered the room, followed by a tall man with dark hair. Meg immediately stood up, her face pale. "Daddy," she exclaimed, "what are you doing here?" Howard Hudson's face was stern. "The police called me," he said. "I flew here as soon as I heard. Detective Keat met me at the airport." He gestured for her to sit. "Now sit down, Meg. I need you to listen to me." Meg sat, her hands trembling in her lap. Her father didn't spare a glance at Nick, who remained quiet in his chair. "Last week, Johnny Vickers came to my house," Howard began, his tone heavy. "He wanted to talk about his daughter, Anna. You remember Anna, don't you, Meg? 3 months ago, she jumped off a bridge in Boston and died. She was young, beautiful, rich, and she didn't want to live. Do you know why?" Meg's face was frozen, but she didn't answer. "Because she loved a man," Howard said. "A man who took her money, ran away, and left her. And that man was called—" "No," Meg interrupted, her voice shaking. "Yes, Meg," Howard continued. "That man was called Mr. Hollywood." Meg's voice rose. "No," she cried. Howard ignored her. "Yes, Meg," he said firmly. "To you he gave the name Craig Winters. But when Anna Vickers knew him, he was Carl Windsor. He liked all his girlfriends to call him Mr. Hollywood. He took nearly $50,000 from Anna. And there was a girl before her." Meg shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. "It's not true," she shouted. "It is true," her father insisted. "Winters gets all his money from rich men's daughters. Johnny Vickers loved his daughter. After Anna died, he went to her house in Boston, found her letters, and learned about the money, and about the name Mr. Hollywood. Then he came to me." Howard paused, looking hard at his daughter. "I told him about you, Meg. I said, 'My daughter's got a new boyfriend, and she calls him Mr. Hollywood. I don't like him, but I can't stop her. She's going away to meet him next week. What can I do?'" Howard's voice dropped. Johnny put his hand on my arm and said, "Don't be afraid for your daughter. I'm going to find that man and stop him." The room was silent except for Meg's quiet sobbing. Finally, Detective Edmonds spoke. "Vickers told us everything, Miss Hudson. He followed you to Whistler and saw you with Nick. That's when he began to suspect the wrong man." Howard Hudson turned to Nick. "You're the travel writer, right?" "Lords." "Nick Lords," Nick said, his voice steady. "Vickers nearly killed me. He shot at me twice." Howard barely acknowledged Nick's words, his attention fixed on his daughter. "How much money did you give him, Meg?" Her voice was a whisper. I gave him $25,000, she admitted. "Only for 2 or 3 months," he said. She broke down again, tears spilling onto the table. Howard's face hardened. "Well, you can say goodbye to that money," he said coldly. Nick turned to Detective Edmonds. "What's going to happen to Vickers?" he asked. "The hospital, I think," Edmonds replied. "Okay, he shot at you, and about 50 people saw him, but he's not a well man. The doctors are going to put him away in a hospital." Howard stood, signaling to his daughter. "Come on, Meg. I'm taking you home. My plane is waiting at the airport." Meg followed her father to the door but paused and turned back to Nick. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I got you into all this. I called you Mr. Hollywood and that was wrong. But I didn't know." "It's okay," Nick said. "You know everything now. Better to learn it now than later. $50,000 later." Meg gave him a sad smile before following her father out of the room. Nick leaned back in his chair, staring at the empty doorway. The danger was over, but his mind still raced with unanswered questions, and the memory of a gun aimed at him in a crowded tea room. Chapter 8: A Nice Smile. Nick took the evening ferry back to Vancouver, the events of the day weighing heavily on his mind. Exhausted and famished, he made his way to the ferry's bustling restaurant. Finding only one free table, he sat down quickly, eager to eat, and put the chaos of the past few days behind him. "I need to get back to work tomorrow," he thought, "and forget about millionaires' daughters and men with guns." As he picked at his meal, he heard a voice. "Excuse me," a soft voice said. "Can I sit with you?" Nick looked up to see a pretty girl standing next to the table, smiling warmly. Her dark hair framed her face, and her eyes sparkled with friendliness. Nick stood up immediately. "It's okay," he said. "You can have this table. I don't want it." The girl tilted her head in surprise. "Please don't go," she said. "Stay and finish your dinner." Her smile was charming, inviting. It was the kind of smile that could make someone forget their troubles. But Nick knew better. He'd had enough of nice smiles for one day. "I'm not hungry," he said, shaking his head. Without another word, he turned and walked quickly out of the restaurant. As he stepped into the cool evening breeze on the ferry deck, he let out a deep breath. The waves lapped gently against the ship, and the lights of Vancouver glimmered in the distance. No more distractions, he thought. Back to the mountains, back to writing. That's where I belong. And with that, Nick leaned on the railing, staring out at the calm waters, determined to leave the drama of the past week far behind.